Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio, the only show that takes a look at the obstacles and opportunities open to small to mid-sized enterprises that manufacture here in America. Brought to you by All Metals and Forge Group, with your hosts Tim Grady and Lou Weiss.
Welcome back, everyone, to Manufacturing Talk Radio. My name's Tim Grady. I'm here with my co-host, Lou Weiss. Lou's with All Metals and Forge Group, the sponsor of Manufacturing Talk Radio. And we've just been speaking with Brad Holcomb, who is the chair of the Institute of Supply Management's Manufacturing Business Survey Committee, about the May report on business for manufacturing, which is a rather positive report. Each month they roll up that number to come up with what the number is for the previous month, and they release it the first business day of the month shortly after 10 a.m. So if you want to kind of put that on your calendar and take a look at it going forward, it's always an interesting discussion with Brad to find out what are the numbers behind the numbers and what do they mean. We're now talking with Professor Adriana Sanford. She's a clinical associate professor in the Department of Management for Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business, specializing in law, international management, leadership, and business ethics for managers. She also teaches at W.P. Carey's Supply Chain Management Department. She's ASU's Lincoln Professor of Global Corporate Compliance and Ethics to some 85,000 students, as well as staff, faculty, and the broader local and global community. She's with the APB speaker for the American Program Bureau, and she is our special ethics correspondent for Manufacturing Talk Radio. So, Professor Sanford, let's talk a bit about counterfeits in the supply chain. There's some pretty scary stuff in here, and you've used a couple of examples such as purses and the purchase of counterfeit purses and where that money goes. Can you share that with our listeners?
Sure. Product counterfeiting is a problem for all industries, and some of those are luxury items, such as purses and watches and whatnot. The concern there is that it's not really a victimless crime, as many people believe it to be. In many of these cases, it's actually tied to terrorist financing. Also, if you take a look, it's about 5 to 7% of world trade comes from counterfeit products, according to the International Chamber of Commerce, and that's about $6 billion in international trade that's just coming from these problems, these challenges. The challenges, however, are not only in the luxury items. The challenges exist with regards to electrical issues, with regards to pharmaceuticals, so they affect our health. There are safety dangers as well. Each incident can potentially affect thousands of parts in a manufacturing company, and that's millions of dollars in revenue and lives.
Professor Sanford, I understand that in some, and I was just reading up on this, 23% of the cases that they've uncovered, the employees of the company knew that they were putting counterfeit parts into the supply chain. That's rather staggering.
That is a concern, and that is a fact. It is a very big concern because a lot of times employees are not trained and do not understand the consequences. They may be making a deadline or budget constraints, and they don't realize that this may later on cause a recall, and it can affect your whole company. Or it may be somebody in the company that decides to look the other way, maybe an executive, because they're more focused on meeting that bottom line.
Professor, we know that there's a lot of counterfeiting that goes on in all sectors. What's happening in the aspect of catching the wrongdoers and prosecuting and so on? Is there much of an activity in that area?
There is, and there are certain countries that are more active than others. The Philippines has been very active, and the U.S. is very active. Some countries, however, only look at counterfeit if it is local counterfeit. And if it is a foreign company's product, they don't do much. So really what we need to see is more international coordination. Companies, multinationals, should be casting a wider net in order to train their employees and their subsidiaries and really reach out to other governments, to other countries for help.
We've been reaching out to Mexico we've started sending down a lot of aerospace manufacturing. There's altogether about 400 aerospace-related companies now in Mexico. Many of them moved from the U.S., and many of them have been developed in Mexico. And I know Mexico also has a counterfeit problem. Are you versed at all in what's going on down there in the manufacturing sector?
Sure. What's going on? Basically, the U.S. government works very closely with Mexico because we have a treaty in place. And these are situations where it's actually easier to seize product. Obviously, the brand owners have an interest in this, the governments have an interest, and the professional associations. And if everybody works together, it's easier to tackle this global problem. It's a global network. So if you've got the governments involved and they're working together and there's a treaty like there is with Mexico, it makes it a lot easier to seize the product. The problem is this is a very hot issue for terrorists, for organized crime, because unlike drug trafficking and human trafficking, they avoid detection, they avoid arrests. And usually it's not in the limelight, it's not in the spotlight. So this is now one of the ways in which they are working, because obviously it's a lot easier. And that is why it is a concern for the Mexican government and for the U.S. government, as well as for global security. We want to assure ourselves that we're protected, and our manufacturers, our executives, and our companies are protected.
So I want to kind of circle back to a comment you made that sometimes the provider of the counterfeit part is one of the larger customers or suppliers for the company. I'd read where vendors in 20% of the cases are well aware that the parts that they're providing are counterfeits. How does it work when it's one of the larger, did you say customers or vendors to it?
Well, let's back up. Let's talk about counterfeit product. When we're talking about counterfeit product, we may be talking about a knockoff. Maybe somebody is copying your watch or your purse. That's a knockoff. And usually you can tell a knockoff, they're not well made. So in cases like that, a company may have the market, the foreign market, and may say, that knockoff is so different from my own product that it's not going to bother me. The problem in that particular case, if you're dealing with a knockoff, is that the person making that knockoff is going to get better and better and better. All of a sudden, the product looks just like yours, but may not function as well as yours. So now people are associating that knockoff that looks identical to yours and thinking that you have a poor product. But that counterfeiter is going to continue to make a good product. And then there may be some mixing and in the gray market, and the product is being sold next to your product on the same shelf. Well, once that counterfeiter gets really good, do you think he's going to keep your name? He's going to make up his own name, and now there's a brand new product which is identified, and consumers say, wow, this is a good product, and you know what? Don't buy this other one, because sometimes you get faulty production, which in reality was never faulty production. It was a counterfeit. It was allowed to fester and grow. Okay, so that's a knockoff. The other issue is when you have third shifts, you will ask someone else to provide you the product, and you give them a blueprint. And they do a great job, and maybe you're doing this in another country because it's cheaper to produce. But what happens is after production is over, there's what's called another shift, a third shift, after hours. And somebody in that company starts producing the product and selling it. There again, the executive, somebody who's not ethical within the company, may decide it's okay because the cost of producing the product is cheaper and they don't really pay attention to where that third shift is going. And that may be going towards terrorist financing. And lastly, the third way that you may see counterfeit product is sometimes products are not perfect, or there are safety concerns. So those products, because not every product you manufacture is perfect, you do have defective products, those are supposed to be thrown away. Luxury companies take particular close attention to this because they want to make sure that that zipper is perfect and, in line with their brand. So what may happen sometimes is that product is taken and stolen and sold in the gray market, sold in other places. And that's when you end up with a purse that looks almost identical to the purse that you want. Again, the concern is who's making the money, who's taking that product. And some executives will look the other way because they don't either want to disturb the market, or it may be that they just have the market and they don't want to be bothered with this. A lot of times not enough money is allocated to IP, and that's a problem. We need to see more resources for IP enforcement in companies, and we need to make consumers aware of what's really going on and our concern with terrorist financing.
Professor Sanford, I know the knee-jerk reaction may be that all of this counterfeiting must be coming out of China, but is that really the case?
No, the problem of counterfeit is not only in China. It occurs in other pockets, in other regions, and in other countries. So we really need to work closely with these governments, and if they don't have strong IP legislation or they're not enforcing their legislation, we need to work with our own government or a foreign government that may be actually already working on this issue to ensure that we have protection. The tri-border region is a very dangerous region in Latin America, and there's a lot of counterfeiting that crosses. And it's been tied to terrorism in the embassy, the bombing in Argentina, but it's also tied to global security issues.
Now, as we look around the world and say, gee, it's coming from Latin America, it's coming from South America, it's coming from China, is any of it coming from the United States itself?
I don't know. I can't answer that. There's so much. It's a very complex issue. You really, if you're interested in knowing this and you are a company that's dealing with this or having an issue, you need to really vet your investigators and especially make sure, that you have a quality control unit in place. With regards to the U.S., I think we have a pretty good handle of it. I feel very comfortable with our manufacturing, that takes place here in this country. But in any situation, you always have to be aware and really have the right network, the compliance program in place.
So now we know we've got a problem. How are supply chain leaders well positioned to implement controls to reduce and eventually eliminate counterfeit products from the supply chain and protect their companies?
Well, the supply chain is on the front line. They're able to see what's happening. They're really the ones that can watch, because a lot of times it will happen there. It'll happen in other countries, and right now there's a lot of new legislation coming out in the U.S. and in the UK with regards to human right-related risks. And within that, it's human right-related risks and transparency in the supply chain. When we're talking about counterfeiting and the production of counterfeit product, we're talking many times about poor working conditions. We're talking often about child labor. So there's going to be legislation requiring transparency in the supply chain to make sure that we have no human right-related risks. And with that, there's going to be a lot more focus, and we're going to find counterfeit products.
Now, I noticed in talking with you on this subject and a couple of others, Professor, that there are some liabilities for company executives when they discover issues of this nature. What kind of liabilities are we talking about?
Well, the concern that we have is any decisions that a company takes, any multinational takes, needs to be considered from a global perspective. It needs to be looked at with a global lens, because depending on the countries you're working with, some of their legislation has extraterritorial effects. And sometimes the multi-jurisdictional requirements and the different approaches that they're taking to a problem, either it be counterfeiting or it be a security issue or data protection or whatnot, money laundering, the approaches may be different, and the new and diverse legislation on how to approach that issue of corruption may conflict. The legislation, when it conflicts with each other, causes a major ethical dilemma, because that executive won't know how to act, or that multinational may be caught in the middle.
You gave us an example, which I thought was a great one, which I'd like you to repeat, and you don't have to mention the name of the company, obviously, but a situation where one government, and I think it was the U.S. government, is demanding one thing, but they're involved with another government under a different body of laws that won't allow them to do that thing, and they get caught in a real catch-22. Can you share that?
Sure, that's happening right now, and our multinationals are very concerned, because both the U.S. and the region is the EU in that particular case, but it can also happen with Malaysia and the Philippines and the U.S. or pockets of Latin America. But basically what happens is in some of these countries, there's a duty to report. U.S. companies and U.S. executives must always comply with U.S. law. You always do, as an American, what you have to do for your country, but then you also must comply with the laws of the other country. So an example is we're seeing it right now with data protection reform, with the EU Data Protection Directive that's in place, where companies are being forced to give information to the U.S. government for investigations, and at the same time they're being told by the EU Data Protection Directive that they cannot, that they must first take certain steps with the EU. There's a predicament. Another one, we in the United States have not adopted the Gatekeepers Initiative. This has created a challenge because even though it's not adopted here, it's been adopted, or guidelines or pieces of it have been adopted by the EU and by other regions of the world. And that requires our accountants and our lawyers to disclose money laundering, to disclose anything that they suspect, and especially if they know about corruption and it's tied to terrorist financing. And that puts people in a predicament because if they disclose it, they may get in trouble, especially if it's a lawyer, and it puts these people in a predicament because our governments are not right now collaborating on these issues, and they're not looking at how it affects those executives and those lawyers.
And you don't just have to be a large multinational corporation to have these kind of challenges. Certainly any manufacturer in the U.S. of any size who is purchasing or sourcing product that comes from overseas could have an issue they are not aware of. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's going to be even broader because the new data protection regulation, that is coming out, and I believe it's coming out next year, is broader. You don't have to have a subsidiary, you don't have to have a branch, and you don't have to have an office. If you are monitoring EU citizens, or if you are actually on the internet and have EU citizens purchasing your product, you are under their new regulation. And the same is true for a lot of these other issues with regards to briberies, with regards to money laundering. In some of these countries, you will have your very own money laundering offense, particularly in like Malaysia and the Philippines, if you don't disclose it.
Well, that's pretty scary. I know the Department of Justice takes a pretty dim view of things like kickbacks and money laundering. It's pretty aggressive at prosecuting those cases.
They're very aggressive, and that's great. But the problem is when it comes to executives and it comes to disclosure, the requirements are not in line between the countries. And what you're permitted or need to do in some countries can create criminal liability if you don't, especially for executives and for their in-house counsel. And the concern is, how do they react? What should they do? The way I look at this is you need to have moral courage, and you really need to follow your belief system. And if you see that there's terrorist financing, if you see that there's money laundering, we've got our people, we've got our law enforcement and our military out there risking their lives. And in my opinion, our war on terrorism is only as strong as our weakest link, and we can't let that weak link be our business link. So we have to stand up if we see this. And our countries need to work together so that we can have a global security front.
Lou, before we sign off with Professor Sanford, is there anything else that you would like to explore with her on this topic?
Well, I think that her last comments, Professor, are quite powerful. And, we are talking about global issues. It's no longer our country, our little country that is running the roost. We're all involved together, and I think it was a very good point that you were bringing out, that this is global, and that perhaps what needs to be done is that these laws and regulations from one country to another have to be universalized, if there's such a word, and working together to end this plague of bad parts, risking of life, and supporting terrorism. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for being on our show, and We're going to see you on a regular basis. I do want to mention to our listeners that 2 points. One is that you can listen to this entire show if you missed the beginning of it at mfgtalkradio.com. And also, you will see when you go to this particular show that we do have a listener survey that we'd really like you to participate in. And we're giving you one of our fancy Manufacturing Talk Radio mugs for filling out the survey. So we would like you to take advantage of that. And thirdly, I would like to point out that if any of our listeners have comments, we welcome your comments and we'll respond to all of them. Send your comments to comments@mfgtalkradio.com. And I guess while I'm on a roll, I may as well speak about next week's show. We're going to have our 5th in a series, 5 of 5, aerospace on the West Coast. So surely tune in to that. And Tim, I think you got more than you bargained for here, so I'm going to flip it back to you.
That's okay. I want to thank Brad Holcomb for being on the show. Brad is always a terrific contributor to give in-depth information on this report on business for manufacturing. There's so much more behind the number when you hear 52.8 for May, which is usually the sound bite on the nightly news. There's so much more information there in the report. We encourage you to go to the Institute for Supply Management.org and drill down in their section for the ISM report on business. Take a look at that. I want to thank Dr. Sanford for joining us again on the show. She is our kind of another recurring guest, our special ethics correspondent. Dr. Sanford, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from both of those guests in future shows, and that wraps us up today for Manufacturing Talk Radio. If you would like to follow us on something like Twitter, it's at MFG Talk Radio. Go to our website, mfgtalkradio.com, to listen to any of our previous shows. Also, this show will be posted there very shortly. And we thank you for listening to the Manufacturing Talk Radio today, the voice of manufacturing globally.
Thanks for joining us on Manufacturing Talk Radio. You can hear our next broadcast each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at mfgtalkradio.com.